It's about what?
I'm sad for those who don't feel that they are loved in order to work in this.
For decades, one man in a cardigan taught millions of children that their feelings were valid, that they were loved just as they were, and that the world, scary as it could be, was still worth trusting. Fred Rogers became something close to a national grandfather figure, a soft-spoken presence whose calm was almost otherworldly. But calm is rarely as simple as it looks from the outside. Long after his passing, the woman who knew him better than anyone else finally opened up about the parts of Fred Rogers that never made it onto the screen. What she described was not a scandal, not a hidden vice, not a secret identity. It was something quieter and in many ways harder to hear. The truth that even the gentlest man alive carried burdens he never let the camera see. This is the story of Fred Rogers, the marriage that shaped him, and the honest, human truth his wife eventually chose to share with the world. When Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood premiered on public television in 1968, it looked almost nothing like the children's programming around it. There were no wild colors, no frantic pacing, no jokes designed purely to keep young eyes glued to the screen. Instead, viewers watched a man walk through a door, hang up his jacket, change into a zip-up sweater and a pair of sneakers, and speak to them as though they were sitting in the room with him. It was slow by design. Fred Rogers believed children deserved patience, not spectacle. Over more than 3 decades on the air, the show became a kind of emotional education that no other program attempted at the time. Fred tackled subjects most children's television avoided entirely: divorce, death, anger, fear, and the confusion of growing up in a world that didn't always make sense. He never spoke down to his young audience. He trusted them to handle honesty, as long as it was delivered with warmth. Alongside the real-world segments, the show ventured into the neighborhood of make-believe, a puppet kingdom where characters voiced by Fred himself acted out the very feelings children were working through in their own lives. Each puppet carried a piece of Fred's own personality, giving him an outlet to express sides of himself the live-action segments didn't always allow. The show ran for hundreds of episodes and earned a long list of honors, including multiple Daytime Emmy Awards and a Lifetime Achievement Award in the late 1990s. During that acceptance speech, Fred famously asked the audience to sit in 10 seconds of silence and think about someone who had helped them become who they were. The room, filled with television professionals rarely known for sentimentality, fell completely still. It was a small moment that captured exactly why his approach worked. He never asked anything of an audience that he wasn't willing to do himself. Even guests on the show reflected his philosophy. Musicians, authors, and everyday tradespeople sat across from him and were treated with the same seriousness and respect as anyone else. To Fred Rogers, dignity wasn't reserved for the famous. It was owed to everyone always. Long before she was known as Fred Rogers' wife, Joanne Bird was building a life entirely her own. Born in Florida in the late 1920s, she grew up in a household that placed real value on conversation, curiosity, and music. Her talent at the piano revealed itself early, and by the time she reached college, she wasn't simply a hobbyist. She was a serious musician with an ear and a discipline that set her apart. Joanne studied music at Rollins College in Florida, where she majored in performance and quickly earned a reputation among her professors and peers for the depth she brought to every piece she played. She wasn't chasing applause. Music, for her, was closer to a language than a career path, a way of communicating things that words on their own couldn't quite reach. She went on to further her studies, eventually landing in Pittsburgh, where her musical education continued to deepen. Along the way, she also became a teacher, passing her knowledge on to younger students at a preparatory music school and later at a small college. She built a career as a concert pianist as well, performing as part of a piano duo and recording albums with a longtime musical partner. Her later years brought recognition for that lifelong dedication, including an honorary degree acknowledging her decades of contribution to music and education. What stands out most about Joanne's early life is how fully formed she already was before she ever met the man who would become her husband. She wasn't looking to be defined by someone else's fame. She had her own ambitions, her own talents, and her own sense of who she wanted to be in the world. That independence would go on to matter enormously in the decades that followed. Fred and Joanne first met as students at Rollins College in the late 1940s, two young musicians circling the same practice rooms and recital halls. Joanne wasn't the type to be swept off her feet by charm alone. What drew her to Fred wasn't a grand gesture. It was the way he listened. In a room full of people eager to be heard, Fred paid attention fully and without distraction, and that quality was rare enough to notice. Their relationship grew the way many meaningful things do, slowly, through shared rehearsals, long conversations, and the kind of quiet understanding that doesn't need to announce itself. When Fred left for New York to take a job in television production, the two were separated by hundreds of miles and years before video calls or instant messaging existed. Their relationship survived on letters, an old-fashioned kind of patience that forced both of them to put real thought into every word they sent. It was through one of those letters that Fred proposed. Joanne has described being so overwhelmed by the news that she rushed out to call him, nearly losing the letter itself in her hurry. She held onto it carefully afterward, aware even then that it marked the beginning of something significant. They married in 1952, launching a partnership that would last more than 50 years. Their marriage wasn't built on public displays or dramatic milestones. It was built on shared rhythm, shared values, and an ability to hear each other in ways few outsiders ever fully understood. Music remained central to their relationship throughout their lives together. The couple would often sit down and play piano duets, finding as much joy in the occasional missed note as in the moments of perfect harmony. They raised two sons, James and John, in a household that combined structure with genuine warmth. Joanne often took on the role of disciplinarian, something Fred, gentle by nature even at home, struggled with more than she did. It was a small but telling detail. The man millions of children saw as an endlessly calm, all-knowing figure needed his wife to help hold the practical, occasionally difficult parts of parenting together. Public perception of Fred Rogers often flattened him into something closer to a saint than a person, endlessly patient, endlessly kind, seemingly incapable of frustration or doubt. Joanne pushed back gently against that image for years. She didn't dispute that her husband was kind. She insisted, though, that his kindness wasn't effortless. It was a discipline, something he actively chose and worked at day after day, rather than a trait he was simply born with. Fred kept a strict personal routine throughout his adult life. He swam nearly every morning and weighed himself daily, keeping his weight steady at exactly 143 pounds for most of his life, a number that would later take on deep personal meaning connected to the phrase, "I love you." 1 letter, for letters, 3 letters. It was a quiet, private ritual that reflected how intentional he was about even the smallest details of his life. That same intentionality came with real pressure. Fred was acutely aware of how many children looked up to him, and he carried the weight of that responsibility seriously. He rarely spoke publicly about the toll it took, but those closest to him, especially Joanne, saw the tired days and the moments of quiet self-doubt that never made it in front of a camera. Being Mr. Rogers for the public and being Fred Rogers in private were not always the same effortless state of being. The calm audiences saw on screen was often something he had to actively build each day. Their marriage, like any long partnership, had its own strains. Fred's work demanded enormous emotional investment, and that investment didn't stay contained to the studio. It came home with him. Joanne often had to be the steady one, the anchor, while Fred carried the emotional responsibility of speaking to a generation of children about difficult, sometimes painful subjects. It wasn't always balanced, and it wasn't always easy, but it was honest. And that honesty is a large part of why their story resonates the way it does. Fred Rogers' final years brought a challenge no cardigan or gentle voice could soften: a diagnosis of stomach cancer. According to Joanne, the earliest signs were easy to dismiss, some discomfort and indigestion that seemed minor at first. Fred, characteristically private, tried to manage the early symptoms quietly on his own, adjusting his diet and pushing through the discomfort rather than raising alarm. By the time the pain became impossible to ignore, the diagnosis was serious. The cancer had already spread, and the prognosis was not favorable. What followed were difficult months of treatment that tested both Fred's physical endurance and the emotional foundation he and Joanne had built together over half a century. Even in that difficult stretch, Fred pushed to stay engaged with the people and causes he cared about. In January 2003, just weeks before his death, he made a public appearance as Grand Marshal of the Rose Parade, a brief, deliberate return to the spotlight that reflected how much his commitments still mattered to him. After undergoing surgery, Fred spent time recovering in the hospital before eventually returning home. Joanne has spoken about how music, so central to their relationship from the very beginning, continued to offer him comfort even as his body weakened. Playing the piano became one of the few things that still brought him a sense of peace during those final weeks. Fred passed away at home on February 27, 2003, surrounded by family, just one day after his grandson's birthday. For a long time afterward, Joanne chose to keep many of the private details of his illness to herself, partly out of respect for the image Fred had spent a lifetime building, and partly because grief, especially public grief, is its own complicated process. Eventually, though, she began to feel that keeping those details hidden wasn't doing justice to who Fred really was. Sharing the harder, more human parts of his final years wasn't about tearing down his legacy. It was about making that legacy more honest, and, in her eyes, more meaningful. A man who faced illness with courage while still wrestling with fear and vulnerability was, to her, far more worth admiring than a flawless, untouchable icon ever could be. In later interviews and documentary appearances, Joanne offered glimpses into those final years, including Fred's ability to hold onto his sense of humor even as his health declined. That humor didn't disappear during his illness. It simply changed shape, becoming one more way he tried to make the experience easier for the people around him. Illness has a way of reshaping even the strongest relationships, and Fred and Joanne's marriage was no exception. For most of their lives together, Fred had been the steady emotional presence in their household, the one who absorbed the world's difficulties so others didn't have to. His illness reversed that dynamic. Joanne stepped into the role of caregiver, a position that brought its own exhaustion, fear, and quiet grief long before he was actually gone. She has described the strange duality of that period, still feeling deep love and admiration for the man she had spent her life with, while also watching him become someone who now needed her strength in a way he never had before. It was a role reversal that tested her, even as it deepened their connection during his final months. After his death, Joanne didn't disappear from public life the way some might have expected. Grief, she later admitted, doesn't move in a straight line or wrap itself up neatly on any particular schedule. Some periods left her feeling capable and energized. Others left her depleted. She was candid about how exhausting the grieving process could be, even years after his passing, refusing to pretend that loss simply resolves itself with enough time. Rather than retreating after Fred's death, Joanne took an active role in preserving the work he had spent his life building. She became chair emerita of Fred Rogers Productions, the company behind his television programs, helping ensure that the values at the center of his work continued even as the media landscape shifted dramatically in the years that followed. She also stepped into the public eye in ways she hadn't during Fred's lifetime, giving interviews, appearing in documentaries, and sharing stories about who Fred really was, both the version the world knew and the private man she lived alongside for more than 50 years. In 2019, she even made a brief appearance in a major film about Fred's life, a small but meaningful way of placing herself directly into the retelling of their story rather than staying entirely behind the scenes. Throughout it all, her own identity as a musician remained intact. She continued to be recognized for her contributions to music and education long after Fred's passing, a reminder that her life was never simply an extension of his fame. She had built something of her own long before they ever met, and she never let that get lost in his legacy. Few numbers carry as much emotional weight as 143 did for Fred Rogers. The code was simple: 1 letter for I, for letters for love, 3 letters for you. It wasn't a marketing gimmick or a cute detail invented for the show. Fred built it into his actual daily life, maintaining his weight at exactly 143 pounds for most of his adult years, a quiet, private ritual that turned a personal number into a lasting statement about how he wanted to live. That symbol outlived him. In 2019, the state of Pennsylvania, Fred's home state, officially designated May 23rd as 143 Day, chosen because it falls on the 143rd day of the year. The idea behind the day was simple and entirely in keeping with everything Fred stood for. Do something kind, say something thoughtful, be a good neighbor to someone who needs it. Joanne Rogers passed away on January 14, 2021, at the age of 92, in the Pittsburgh home she and Fred had shared for decades. She was surrounded by loved ones, and she left behind a legacy every bit as meaningful as her husband's, not simply as the woman who supported a beloved public figure, but as an accomplished musician, educator, and steward of a story that continued to matter to millions of people long after the cameras stopped rolling. So what was the awful truth that Joanne Rogers eventually chose to share? It wasn't scandal. It wasn't hidden misconduct or some shocking secret kept locked away for decades. It was something far more human. The truth that Fred Rogers' famous gentleness wasn't automatic. It was a choice he made again and again, often while quietly struggling with doubt, exhaustion, and the pressure of a public image he felt responsible for upholding. It was the truth that even the calmest, most reassuring man on television needed someone in his corner, someone who understood the effort behind the kindness and loved him anyway. Fred Rogers spent his life telling children that their feelings mattered, that it was all right to be scared, sad, or unsure. In the end, his own wife revealed that he needed to hear that message just as much as anyone else. That more than any hidden secret is the real truth Joanne Rogers carried and eventually chose to share with the world. That being good to others